We are waiting for council members Parks and Krikorian, and I understand they are on their way. We do have quite a few recommendations to go through today on items 1 and 2. We will begin with item number 1 and ask the CLA and if we could also have Mr. Grief and Mr. Cohn join us at the front table, and we can just have a conversation.
If I can read the caption for that, Councilman?
Pardon me?
The caption, if I could read it for the record, please.
Please do.
Okay. This item is continued from April 20th, 2010 and May 11th, 2010. Chief Legislative Analyst report and communication from the Business Tax Advisory Committee relative to City of Los Angeles business tax issues.
I do want to note that the city clerk is present, so Adam will be on his best behavior, and hopefully she's not here on a personnel matter.
You're in service of the committee, sir.
Okay. But I think actually she's here because she heard this is the most exciting committee of all and wanted to participate. So thank you very much for joining us. So we have a 100% agreement. Is that not correct?
I don't know. I hope we do. That would make things much easier today.
Without reservation.
With a little bit of skepticism, yeah. If I can make Mr. Grief chuckle, then that'll just make my day.
It's Greif, actually.
Greif. See? Oh, I'm sorry. I said Grief. Okay, that was almost a chuckle.
I'm sorry?
That was almost a chuckle. Okay.
You might say I've heard it before.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah, well, with a name like Cohen, I've heard all kinds of stuff. Okay. CLA.
John Wickham with the Office of the Chief Legislative Analyst. The Business Tax Advisory Committee, BTAC, submitted to your committee a number of recommendations concerning the administration of the business tax. At your meeting of April 20th, you heard the preliminary report on that and requested that our office report back to you. We have completed our review and have a number of recommendations for your consideration. The quick rundown of this is, let me see if I can find the quick summary on this. We recommended action to publish the Office of Finance Audit Manual and to implement the voluntary disclosure and offer and compromise programs as recommended. And let's see. And then we have the additional research that's needed on the advisory notices concept, adjustment of the city attorney settlement authority levels, and the classification on registration program. And then we recommend no action on the permanence of the auditor findings, the current refund and appeals filing periods, and the interest refund rate.
Okay. And the city attorney is present?
Yes, Deputy City Attorney Dan Whitley.
And you had concerns about the second part of the recommendation from BTAC related to what you consider to be attorney-client privilege?
That was with respect to the disclosure of attorney memorandum to the Office of Finance. That was our concern.
Mr. Greif, have you resolved the concerns about that, or?
No, I don't believe we have. Council member, we didn't receive this report until last Friday.
Oh.
So we've had all of, well, I guess, one business day to review it. We do have.
Well, you do realize that.
We do have comments. There was a meeting that you had requested.
You do realize that BTAC members are expected to give up their Saturdays and Sundays and.
In point of fact, I don't think without 3 days public notice we can meet on that basis.
Oh, no, not to meet, but to do work anyway.
Yes, we understand that. We knew that when we signed up for this gig.
There you go.
But we did have a meeting, council member, with Office of Finance, CLA, and CAO that occurred, I think, 3 days after the meeting here in Chambers with your committee. Mm-hmm. The purpose of which was to try and it was at your recommendation and at your request that we so met, the purpose of which was to try and see if there was some commonality of ground and to try and work out some of these things. And then it was handed off to CLA to prepare a report, which at the time we understood would be done shortly thereafter. That meeting occurred on April 23rd, and we didn't receive the report until a month later, although we understand a drafted report was previously circulated. We'd actually requested that that draft be provided to us, and we're told it would be provided to us. And in fact, it was not provided to us.
Let me just make
we haven't
mention
got
that
the final
Mr. Parks and Mr. Krikorian are now present, and we have a quorum, and it's duly noted.
So there were certain parts that we thought were agreed amongst everybody, and we know Office of Finance had signed off on, and yet now appear to be back in play in this document. So we were rather
We're talking about
surprised.
recommendation number 1?
Or
are you talking about the
he was
entire-
summarizing all of the CLA was summarizing all of the recommendations, so my comments relate to all of the recommendations.
Okay,
I'm
can-
prepared to go through, we are prepared to go through each of the
Can we go through each
recommendations.
recommendation one at a time, and so that we can, the things that we agree on, we can just push out, and the things that we don't agree on, we can have some conversation about. So let's start with recommendation number 1.
Yes. Recommendation 1 concerns publication of the Office of Finance Auditor's Manual to the public, as well as their other training materials, and then the various guidance memoranda prepared by the city attorney, the Office of Finance, and historically the city clerk. The Office of Finance is updating their auditor's manual and training materials, and will publish those upon some redactions from at the city attorney's advice.
I don't think there's any controversy relating this.
None at all. We're all in agreement on
You're
that
in
one.
total agreement with BTEC on the auditor's manual being put on the web, right?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any problem with that. Can we all concur on that?
The second piece of that was concerning the city attorney
Hearing no
memorandum.
objection, we stand in concurrence on that.
The second part of that recommendation number 1 concerns the advice from the city attorney. And this is in the city attorney's role as advisor to the Office of Finance, and so there's a certain type of a client-attorney privilege that's going on there. We recognize that there is information that the Office of Finance should and could provide to the general public regarding the implementation and decisions that they make on the business tax. However, the city has a long history of various legal actions taken against it and against the business tax, where some of these kinds of memoranda have been used to the detriment of the city. So our concern is finding some kind of a tool, some kind of a mechanism to provide that public information in a way that doesn't put the city at risk in legal action. So we haven't figured out what that tool is right now. It's not a city attorney memorandum, but there may be some kind of a tool we can craft that the Office of Finance prepares and releases. We just need to do some more work to find something that everybody's comfortable with.
Mr. Greif, does VTAC have any concerns about that?
We do, Mr. Alarcon. We had suggested that anything involving, specific taxpayer information be redacted from those memorandum. But if those memorandums are guidance memorandums, which deal with obviously the interpretation of the city's tax code, then we don't understand why the public shouldn't have the same access to that information as the Office of Finance. It shouldn't be a catch-22 for the public. They should know what they're dealing with. We're not talking about creating any liability for the city. We don't believe that would create any liability for the city. Again, any sensitive taxpayer identification type information can be redacted. But this is, if we're talking about guidance that's being provided to the Office of Finance on how to interpret these things, wouldn't it be helpful for each of the businesses filing these returns to understand what the rules are so they can abide by them, which is, I think, what we want?
Yes, but the whole issue of attorney-client privilege is it's on a totally different level. It's not a question of certainly it would make things better for anybody who disagreed with the city if they could get that information. But if it's an issue of attorney-client privilege, we have a problem. So I need to have the city attorney weigh in and explain more fully why this falls into the arena of attorney-client privilege.
Well, all of the memorandum that are going to be at issue are going to be the city attorney's advice to the Office of Finance on specific issues. These issues could be the general application of the municipal code to a general class of taxpayers or to a specific taxpayer. But it's going to be the city attorney's advice to the Office of Finance.
Can I ask you, does every piece of advice and memorandum that you send to the treasurer, or Office of Finance, I should say, fall into the category of something that needs to be shielded as attorney-client privilege, or are there some that do and some that don't?
Very little of the communications between the city attorney's office and the Office of Finance would not be covered by the attorney-client privilege. I can't think of anything that wouldn't be. I mean, there may be a few times we communicate and it's not covered. But by and large, it all is. And one of our main concerns with these memorandum is the city attorney wants to retain the ability to have very frank communications with the Office of Finance. And if these are going to be disclosed online, it's going to hinder our ability to do that.
Okay, I'm going to ask for Mr. Krikorian, who's the only lawyer up here, to weigh in on this, just to...
I'm a lawyer too, just for their...
You're both lawyers. You're both lawyers, but the only lawyer on the committee is Mr. Krikorian, and I'd like to get his take on this. Three lawyers.
I certainly understand the
Change a bulb.
policy objective of trying to get consistent application and to ensure that taxpayers understand the thinking of the city attorney's office in the city on how to evaluate these tax issues. But let me ask the city attorney's office, if there were a blanket rule that guidance memoranda were to be made available to the public, do you think that would impact on the city attorney's office's ability to communicate freely and to provide independent legal advice to the Office of Finance in evaluating tax issues?
We've discussed this internally, and we think that the advice we would be able to give would be very different than the advice we give now. We would have to tender and change the sort of language that we use to reflect that it's going to be publicly disseminated pretty much immediately, rather than the communications we have now where we can be a little more frank. And so that's one of our main concerns. And we're also concerned because we're unaware of any other government that, as a general rule, discloses all of its attorney-client communications.
Right.
This has not been tested in court, so we're not sure that this might not waive our attorney-client privilege in general.
Yeah, and that was going to be what I was going to ask you next. If there were a process by which confidential attorney-client communications were made public by some blanket rule, what would be the city's ability to restrict that rule to specific types of communication, and who would make that judgment as to whether or not a particular communication constituted a guidance memoranda or advice about potential litigation or some other kind of communication?
It's very difficult to say. That's one of our concerns. We're very concerned about what the scope of this would end up being held by a court in later litigation.
And if the city attorney's office felt inhibited in some way to provide frank advice because of the risk of public disclosure of that advice, could that potentially expose the city to taking actions without the benefit of complete legal advice that could expose the city to potential liability?
I think it would do that. It also would, and to some extent, prohibit us from able to advise the Office of Finance from not taking action that's to the detriment of taxpayers.
So if that's the case, I think it would be helpful. I mean, I absolutely understand the objective that you're going for, and it makes perfect sense to me, because the consistency part of this is what has, I think, troubled taxpayers so much, that there are inconsistent applications of the business tax. And so achieving that objective is very important, and having full transparency about how we do that is very important. But I think it's also important that we find a mechanism to do that by which we can avoid some of these adverse impacts that could come from potential unintended waivers of confidential communications.
BTEC?
Go ahead, Saul. Then I have something like that as well. This is Saul Gomez, who just joined us as well.
Saul Gomez, I think the overarching goal on this particular request was really, as you said, Councilman Krikorian, was the transparency and consistency. And when the Board of Review or when Office of Finance cites a certain memo that might have addressed a client from 20 years ago, those memos sometimes are very difficult to find, and it's a ghost memo per se sometimes. And so really what we want is when there's a cite given, for example, at the Franchise Tax Board, the Board of Equalization, when there is a ruling, such as, you're familiar with the enterprise zone, Councilman Alarcon, so the deluxe case, there was a memo and written around what the finding of the deluxe case and what it meant for enterprise zones. And so everyone was given access to that memo, what it meant. It stood for, what hiding behind the vouchers. And so everyone was on the same page on what the Board of Equalization ruling meant for every single taxpayer. And so thereafter, as you move forward, you really, if you had to challenge something, you could just cite the deluxe case because, one, the Board of Equalization had it, wrote it up, and made it public. And two, the taxpayer had it, they could cite it and say based on the, and so both sides really are playing fair on the same side. That's really the intent of it. It isn't to try to go behind attorney-client privilege. We understand that. It's to understand exactly what's being cited, what was the conclusion reached behind that citing, how did you come to that conclusion, which citation are you using, and what's your interpretation of that citation?
So it sounds to me then that there's at least two different things that are going on here. On the one hand, we're talking about internal legal advice provided by the city attorney to the Office of Finance. On the other hand, we're talking about decisions of precedential value for future use. And in the same way that the state attorney general offers attorney general opinions, which are publicly available, can be used as precedent, can be used to achieve consistency in the application of, areas of the law that haven't yet been tested in court. But the attorney general also has confidential communications with state departments. It seems to me that we ought to be able to come up with some mechanism to achieve that, so that there is an advisory opinion, for example, from the city attorney's office, that could be used as precedent in future cases. I don't know. I don't, like, as you suggested at the beginning, I don't have a feel for exactly what that mechanism would be. But if we could create a category of memoranda that would have precedential value or intended to have precedential values, lay out the reasoning for a finding so that future taxpayers could rely upon that reasoning, I think that makes a great deal of good
right now, the Board of Equalization refers to that as published opinion. And so when there is a decision at the Board of Equalization that's really, precedent setting, then they issue a public opinion. They issue a published opinion, and they're told, the taxpayer is told that within 30 to 60 days, the published opinion will be made available. And so,
Okay, but we're talking about advisory memos, and I'm getting a little, because you're talking about a published decision versus advisory memos prior to the published decision. So,
and that's our recommendation, is that we go back and we do a little bit more work to figure out what this published opinion product looks like. What can we release to the public that explains how this tax is being implemented in a way that helps the businesses be more clear and understand what's going on. The one other fact that I actually left out of my report that the city attorney had discussed with me was that as a result of the AB Cellular case, I think it was, that any information like this that is released is viewed as a change in the business tax code itself, as if you had adopted a change to the ordinance, and as a result, because of Prop 218, we cannot change anything that comes out of that memoranda unless we go back to the voters. So it really does put it in stone when we release one of these memos. So the This is not something that the Franchise Tax Board or the Board of Equalization has to deal with. This is something that local government has to deal with. And it's put an extra burden on.
In other words, the remedies are different at the Board of Equalization versus the city's process.
Yes.
So, I mean, where do you appeal the Board of Equalization rulings?
Then after the Board of Equalization, you go to court.
Superior Court?
Yes.
And where do you appeal the city's ruling?
Superior Court as well. I believe what Mr. Wickham is talking about is a slightly different issue, which deals with what our taxes will end up being determined to be by the court. Right now we have our municipal code, which defines our classifications and various other measures. In the AB Cellular case, what the courts held was that informal determinations by an administrative body of a municipality can also be considered our methodology for determining taxation. So the risk we run by having our policies be put into writing and being a guiding policy for the city is that a court will apply AB Cellular and say that these written policies, which are not our code, they're guidelines that are applied by the Office of Finance, will then be held to be a methodology that is used to determine taxation. And once, excuse me, and once that determination is made under AB Cellular, only the voters can then change that methodology. Now this is unsettled law. We only have the AB Cellular case to interpret this so far, and this continues to be litigated. However, it is a concern that, so we're trying to both avoid issues of attorney-client privilege and avoid the potential implications of AB Cellular, but we have discussed this, and I think there is a way we can give guidance to the taxpayers and meet the goals of BTAC without releasing ad hoc all of our guidance to the Office of Finance.
What I'd like to do is move forward with the first part of recommendation number 1 and instruct the CLA and the city attorney to continue to work with BTAC on an alternative remedy to the one proposed by BTAC, and then bring it back as soon as possible. Mr. Parks?
Yeah, I was just wondering from the city attorney and from John, when we're going through Board of Appeal and such, do the city employees ever use the guidance of the city attorney's memos as a basis of their decisions? Do they ever reference them?
I believe they do. Our advice from the city attorney's office is that they do not. Our advice is to treat each taxpayer individually and not to use advice given to other taxpayers or to use advice dealing generally with our municipal code just to avoid.
Well, I think that has to be cleaned up and make sure that that's occurring, because I think if you are an auditor and you're saying I'm going to do A, B, and C because the city attorney's advice of June 12th, then I think your document becomes part of the record. The other side of it is, in looking at this issue, let's see. When and if you ever put together a guidance letter that's for public, would that then necessarily be the appropriate places in the audit manual? So that not only the city employees can reference it, it's available to the public as well. So if it's official and it's for the public consumption, it would appear it should support the audit manual. If it's advice that's protected with clients, then city employees shouldn't reference it as something that it's not.
I think Councilmember Parks is getting to the heart of the matter, which is what we're trying to do is have transparency in the administration of the tax rules. We're trying to have fairness and we're trying to have consistency. And if you have a situation where there's different taxpayers treated differently and you're trying, and that's, takes on the aspects of a game, and this is not meant to be a game. This is meant, it's not meant to be, which situations can the city win based on the fact that they've got information the taxpayer doesn't have. What we want is we want the taxpayers to be able to comply with what the rules are as they understand those rules, and those rules, their understanding of those rules, they should have the same opportunity to understand those rules as the Office of Finance does. And if you look at it, if you want to look at a legal example, an analogy, then think about a prosecutor in a criminal matter, where if a prosecutor has evidence that could be exculpatory evidence and the prosecutor having to discover it, what does the prosecutor have to do? The prosecutor cannot withhold that from the defense. They have to provide that to defense. And so it's not a game here where there's something that OOF knows, or the city attorney knows, and the taxpayer is not privy to that information in terms of how to interpret the rules and how to apply them.
But evidence is different than legal analysis and legal advice given by counsel to a client. But I think you hit on an important point. Maybe there's a way that you could distinguish the result in a prior case from the analysis of how you got there, so that a business that's similarly situated would know that, on X date, some other previous filer in a similar business was treated in a particular way without the inclusion of the legal analysis and advice of how you get from point A to point B. The result really is what's important. If you want to achieve consistency, it's equal treatment to taxpayers who are equally situated. You don't necessarily need to understand the advice that was given to get there, just as long as the treatment is similar in similar cases, and that there's transparency and availability of that information, so that you're right. If there's a taxpayer who's paying a higher rate than somebody else that's similarly situated, just because they haven't been given access to the information that another taxpayer was paying a lower rate, that's not a result that's acceptable either. So I agree with the chair that I think if we take another cut at this, it sounds to me like we're all saying the same thing. We just need to figure out the vehicle by which to get there and still preserve the integrity of the privilege.
Absolutely.
And I think one point that the city attorney made is very important, and having the cases I've seen is that in many cases none of them are identical. So although a taxpayer might say, well, Joe's business got this decision, you have to lay out all the circumstances that impact this taxpayer to be able to come to a conclusion. So there's no universal answer to any set of circumstances.
So Adam, as we go through these recommendations and we want to hold some of these things, can you be thinking about how we bifurcate these things and move forward on some and hold others?
Well, what you would have to do essentially, so far what you've got, it's fairly straightforward. It'd be a recommendation for action in the first piece of recommendation 1, and second piece, essentially, it's an instruction for CLA and city attorney.
Come back with a report, yeah.
Come back and report on that item.
Councilman, we've just covered recommendations 1 and 2 in the CLA report, so your actions so far are consistent with recommendations 1 and 2 from the CLA.
No,
which is to publish the auditor's manual and to direct the city attorney, Office of Finance, CLA to come back with further recommendations on a guidance memo.
Right. I'm just where you said recommendation number 2.
Yes, recommendation 2 in the CLA report.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going by recommendations of the BTAC.
Yeah. So in the CLA report, recommendations 1 and 2 are consistent so far.
I just want to make sure we cover all the recommendations of BTAC and
Yes.
all the recommendations. They're not aligned exactly correctly.
Well, I would modify recommendation 2 to include working with BTAC in that regard, which I noticed BTAC's not cited there.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure that was meant. Right, John?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just an oversight.
Thank you.
Good catch,
Okay, let's move on. The next recommendation?
Yes, the second recommendation concerns the statute of limitations for looking back in the audit period. And BTAC recommended a 3-year look back for the timely filed returns, a 3-year look back for delinquent returns, and then a 6-year look back for unfiled returns. Those are people who are not registered and not filed. This is, the Office of Finance provided a chart that at your last meeting comparing IRS, Franchise Tax Board, the City of Los Angeles, and then the BTAC recommendations on this matter. And in reviewing all of that, our recommendation is actually that the time period, the 3 years that BTAC recommended on the first 2 items was appropriate. And then on the non-registered
Sort of
and
let the cat
non-filed.
out of the bag, guys. There was a considerable discussion about this at the last meeting, and so you've had some time to think about it. And the primary question was, why would we want to limit the number of years we would look back on a business that has been operating illegally? Why would we put any limit on that?
Okay, I'll give you an answer for that. If the intention of forming BTAC was to make the city more business unfriendly, we can disband BTAC. If we're trying to make the city more business unfriendly, then by all means, take it from 8 years and go to infinity.
You're going to have to explain that.
Say you let the cat out of the bag and,
You're going to have to explain
tisk,
that.
tisk.
Because I do not understand how allowing businesses to operate without paying taxes illegally is helpful to businesses that are operating legally.
In fact, I would take it a step
I mean,
further.
I think it's unfair competition.
Yeah, exactly. The most friendly thing we can do to legitimate business operators is ensure that those who are operating illegally pay their fair share of taxes and compete fairly with them.
And I think the other thing, one of the recommendations later actually gives them a little play by saying if you've operated illegally, you can come in and fess up and you don't have to pay penalty, which I think is how we deal with amnesty every couple of years. The one thing also in this, I think the intent of the original motion that went askew, because the intent was to set it up as IRS. Somewhere in the mix, someone created 8 years, and that wasn't the intent. And so I don't know quite if that was done in establishing the ordinance through the CAO or CLA or the city attorney, but that was when Garcetti put that motion forward and I seconded it. It was the very first sentence says make it identical to IRS, so there's consistency. Somewhere somebody stuck 8 years, which is now several years later we find inconsistent with IRS.
I still want an answer to the question. I don't understand what the rationalization is to allow businesses that are operating illegally to have a limited look-back period.
This is Mel Cohn, BTAC member. I'll address that issue. First, I want to point out on this table 1, there is a typo under the registered and timely filed and the registered and late filed for BTAC. The word due should be removed from each of those.
Yeah, that was not our proposal. If you look at our original document, it says 3 years from filing date, not filing due date. And that's the case in both situations, and presumably that was an inadvertent mistake by Office of Finance.
But I do want to address your question of the inconsistency with the IRS, the Franchise Tax Board, and why we are recommending a limitation rather than the no limitation. And it has to do with, 1, bringing revenue into the city, and again, being business friendly. And also just to add that BTAC does accept the present number of years of 8 years rather than the 6 years we originally recommended. We think it's important if a business is going to come forward that they know there is a date certain. Now, we've been through with BTAC 1 where the scofflaw situation was had much more importance when we formed that. But we're at the point today where we think it's important that we bring these businesses into the city. If you have a no limitation on somebody coming in, they aren't going to come in. So we wanted to bring certainty, which is really the mantra of our recommendations, so that businesses know for certain what they can do. And that is our position on why we picked a period rather than an unlimited period. We want to make it attractive for businesses to come in.
Okay. Would it be possible to have a limit for those who voluntarily come in versus those who get caught?
So
I think you and this will come on later, but I think you have that slightly under the VDA as well. And so you really do touch on that, those that do voluntarily come in, hence the voluntary disclosure agreement. That's the triggering mechanism on an annual basis rather than...
The voluntary disclosure agreement has a limit on the look-back period?
Yes, there is a limit in there, and the limit that was proposed by BTAC was 4 years.
Yeah, the limit was 4 years, but what
Yes.
was the, what's the actual?
There is no program right now, so that would be a new,
That's what I was asking.
yes. So
There
that's
there is
brand new.
there is no
No, there
limitation for voluntary.
So the VDA program was adopted by the council in the Budget and Finance Action just last week, and the recommendation from BTAC was for the VDA program to go back 4 years. With an indefinite time period, you might consider going back 6 years. You might open that up a little bit more to give these businesses that Mr. Cohn is talking about a little bit more time. You had to have a 4-year look-back period when you had a 6-year or an 8-year look-back period on the non-filers, because you don't want to encourage people to not pay their taxes. So you have to have some
That's the
flexibility.
same reason that we don't do an amnesty every year.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Because if you did an amnesty every year, people would just kind of wait for the amnesty.
exactly.
Yeah, well, that's why I think it should be permanent. The benefit should be permanent. In other words, if you come forward, we can put a limit on it, but if you don't come forward and we have to go chasing after you, I think we should have no limit.
Yeah.
It's Michael Banner. I'd like to offer one other thought about this that, for your consideration. If you're comparing the limitations with IRS and the franchise tax boards, I think there's a little bit of a difference when you're comparing the gross receipts tax that the city has to other local municipalities where there may not even be a gross receipts tax. So, comparing apples to apples is really where I think you need to look at that, where they don't have to worry about it at all. There is no time requirement because you don't have to pay gross receipts tax. So in terms of the competitive nature of it, I think it's more appropriate to almost look at what are the municipalities doing with this.
Yeah, but if you have no limit, then why would anybody come forward? I mean, if you can operate a business without paying your gross receipts tax, I mean.
But I think that's part of what point I'm trying to make is that there are cities where there is no gross receipts tax, where business will just choose to locate there. And this is a non-issue because they're going someplace where there isn't a gross receipts tax. So we have to compare these policies also against places where you can locate and serve businesses outside the city. So there's another competitive factor is the point I'm making.
I understand the point you're making. I just don't understand how it applies to our city. We have to create a level playing field for all businesses. And we have not touched on the issue of the gross receipts tax per se. But once we have a gross receipts tax, so the question is, how do we create a level playing field? The way you create a level playing field is by saying to those who aren't paying that tax, you got to pay so that so there's fair competition. One restaurant that's paying shouldn't suffer the consequences of being next to a restaurant that's not paying. And so I think that there is a larger issue, the global issue that you just mentioned, but for this particular issue, I think we can split the baby in half here and actually help. And that would be to create a limitation for those businesses that volunteer, and this would be a permanent thing as opposed to an amnesty
Part of
period.
the recommendation.
Right. And so we need to figure out how to do that, and if we can do that real quick, then I'm happy to push it out of this committee today. And the other recommendation would be for those who are avoiding paying the gross receipts tax and not volunteering to step forward, we have an unlimited period.
I think we go back to the intent of the original motion.
Yeah, that's our recommendation. And that's recommendation number 3 in the CLA.
Well, no, your recommendation only spoke to unlimited look-back period. It didn't speak to those who voluntarily.
That's actually on the limit on those who voluntarily come forward is addressed in recommendation number 5, which would instruct the Office of Finance to come back within 45 days on the implementation program for the voluntary disclosure program. So
What do they have to come back with?
they have to come back and explain, is it a 4-year period, is it a 6-year period, and what other, it's a brand new program, there are going to be a number of implementation elements to that, and they haven't been presented for council review and on how to implement that program.
I beg to differ. This has been out there now since we made this recommendation. This has been out there for over a month, so I think Office of Finance has had a chance to think about it.
Did they have to reprogram the computer and all that other stuff with LA Tax?
But I think we should, here they are. I think we should give some instruction right now, and they can come back with a report later.
Ed Cabrera, Office of Finance. Actually, the Office of Finance budget proposal did include a voluntary disclosure program, as well as offer and compromise. We are working on those. What we would respectfully ask is that we be allowed 90 days, because we have a multitude of proposals that we are working on that would give us sufficient time within our present staffing condition to come out with a program and to ensure that we've done the proper vetting in comparison to other taxing agencies. But essentially, as Councilmember Parks indicated, it could involve some programming within LA Tax, so there would need to be some system fixes and measures that would have to be taken. So we believe that if we're allowed 90 days, that would give us sufficient time to come out with a viable response and program, both on the voluntary disclosure,
The CLA recommended 45 days. Why you need to take so long?
Again, we're significantly down in terms of key staff, so we feel that the 90 days would allow us to continue to focus on our revenue projects that are ongoing. In addition, we wouldn't have to divert staff from those revenue generation activities, and we would be able to meet that 90-day time frame.
Yeah, all indications are that implementing a voluntary a voluntary program with limitations on it would create more revenue.
We realize that there is a potential to pull more businesses in, but again, it's just the time frame in terms of comparing and doing our research with other programs to ensure that we're protecting the city's interest as well as providing a viable program for the businesses.
Okay, I don't see why somebody who's operated correctly and gets a 4-year look-back period, I don't see why people who volunteer at a given point after operating illegally should get the same period. But I do think there should be a limit on that to encourage them to come back.
It's actually 4 years versus 3 years, so it is somebody who voluntarily steps forward after noncompliance previously is responsible in our recommendation for an additional year.
You're right. Okay, it's 3 years. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I was looking at the Franchise Tax Board. Franchise Tax Board has 4 years. They have no limitation on this, but I think we need to encourage businesses back into the system. So I'd be looking at no more than a 6-year limit. And all we need to know is whether it's going to be 4 years, according to BTAC's recommendation, or 6 years, and I'm getting the sense from my colleagues here that they'd support that.
I would suggest that the committee bear in mind.
Let me finish, okay?
Certainly.
And so what I'm telling you is I don't think we need 90 days to come to a decision. Now, I recognize that it may take longer to implement, but that's after the fact. The policy decision is before us, and I don't think I need to know what your programming needs are to tell you the policy is wrong. We need to generate revenue. We need to bring these businesses back into the fold, and that's very helpful to the city in the worst economy that you and I have lived through. So, I mean, I'm ready to move this forward, but, I need to hear from you whether 4 years is better than 6.
We will do our best to come back with a report within 45 days, definitely. But as you indicate, it may take a longer period to implement it. What the additional research is that we would need to look at is what would be the criteria that would be set up in terms of what businesses would qualify. In looking at the Internal Revenue Services.
If they volunteer to tell us that they've been operating without paying their taxes, that's the qualification. Okay, what else do you need? How many days did we knock off there?
Again, as indicated, we will do our best to come back within 45 days as you've requested.
No, the CLA requested 45 days. I want to do it 2 weeks from now. I mean, I'm serious.
I do not believe that 2 weeks is realistic. We can come back within 45 days and provide our report.
I'm wondering what the analysis is going to include that is going to take so long.
Well, the analysis, each of the various taxing agencies' criteria, they have specific criteria in terms of whether the information is vetted, how that information is vetted, whether the taxpayer...
I'm sorry, what information is vetted?
The information that the taxpayer, that there are certain criteria that the taxpayer has to provide full and complete information as far as their business activities so that the taxing agencies can determine whether the tax liabilities that have been identified are true and correct, and that way they're able to make a determination in terms of what is the identified liability and what would be the agreed upon settlement liability.
I'm sorry, but I cannot make a nexus between what you are saying and the concept of a look-back period.
Let me just maybe clear. I don't think we're asking you to analyze each business in the sense of if they come forward. We're just saying what's reasonable. Is it 4 years, 6 years?
Oh, yeah, in that case, yes. In that case, we can come back much quicker.
Yes. The thing is, all they're saying is, can you tell us 4 years, 6 years, 8 years?
Yes, we will come back with that in a 2-week period, correct.
The other thing is we need to know if you come back with a limitation, are we still talking about forgiveness of the penalty?
Exactly. That's what we would have to look at as far as whether what we're talking about principal, whether we're talking about interest or penalties. Those are all factors that we would have to take a look at.
Take longer to implement it, but you can give us that
Yes.
Okay,
Correct.
then my understanding of this is, it is the inclination of this committee to split the winnings in half here. Those who do not report voluntarily will continue to have an unlimited look-back period. But the inclination is that those who voluntarily come forward will get a limited look-back period. And the only question is whether it's 4 years, 6 years, or 8 years. And I think, we need some minimal understanding of the implications of that like in 4 years, it might entice a lot of businesses to come in very quickly. 8 years might not be that great of an enticement because they may have to pay a lot more taxes. So we need to have a better understanding. Now, the implementation of that program, we need to understand. How long is it going to take to get there? But I want to move the policy forward. Okay, so we're going to hold this matter for 2 weeks with that in mind, and see if we can't get a better idea of what your recommendation might be with regard to the time for the look-back period for those who come forward voluntarily.
Chairman Alicant?
Yes.
I would like to just go back to the point I made of eliminating the word due in the BTAC proposal for registered and timely filing and registered and filing late. This is a very important issue because currently Los Angeles starts their tolling from the date of deficiency assessment, which can be indeterminate. The other taxing agencies and what we're recommending is to start from the filing date. And it's really important because that sets a definite time when someone knows that it's from the filing point where an assessment date is unknown. So we would like that to be included in the change.
And we had a brief discussion on this last time, but you're just saying, I don't even know what a filing due date is, to tell you the truth, but...
For 22,
yeah.
which is the 28th of February, I think it is, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a filing date. It's the 28th of February for the prior year, for the prior calendar
Right.
year.
Unless an extension has been granted by the city.
So you're saying from the filing date?
Yes, and that is consistent with the other taxing agencies. Because the assessment is indeterminate that date. It could be a long time in the future.
Can I get a response from the finance department?
We basically broke it down into two areas. One, if a taxpayer files timely, and two, if a taxpayer is delinquent. We do concur with if a taxpayer is delinquent in terms of 3 years from the date that they eventually do file. So the due date is February 28th of each year for the annual tax. If they subsequently file it, let's say April 1st, we do concur with the statute running from that point. In terms of a taxpayer who does file timely, what we would...
Did you all agree on that, or?
Yeah, correct.
We agree. That's
Correct, filing date.
That's the filing date, whether
Yep.
they file late.
No, but you're running under that
Currently, right now, we run from
Operate under
the
that.
date of delinquency if they never file. So if a taxpayer is an annual taxpayer, the tax is due February 28th, based on our and city attorney's legal analysis. If they do not file their taxes, the statute of limitation begins to run on March 1st, and the city has a 3-year period to attempt collection, eventually through litigation. So in cases where taxpayers have filed, if they do file timely, what we would recommend is it's from the due date rather than the filing date, so that it is a consistent statute period, and that would essentially be February 28th.
Okay, I'm just trying to get whether you agree. Are you agreeing with BTAC's recommendation?
We agree with one provision as far as a requested change.
Tell me what you agree on so we can get that out of here.
Well, we agree to the extent that if a taxpayer does file timely, meaning by February 28th, that the statute would be 3 years from that filing date, from the due date, from that.
Okay, so you agree with that?
Well, if
Filing date.
from the filing date, so if a business were to file, let's say, February 5th, just like you would in your income tax, just like you would in your state tax, the date you sign that return and the date you submit it is really when the clock starts ticking on statute of limitations.
I got it. Are you okay with that?
I think for consistency, we should have one date, and that would be February 28th. And I believe that's also what the Franchise Tax Board does. If they file timely, it's not based on when they file, but it's as long as they file by the due date. And that would be for consistency's sakes. Otherwise, we would have different statute dates as far as commencement
The
for different
matrix that we have, the chart that we have before us says that it's from the date of filing.
No.
The Franchise Tax Board.
Actually, there was a typo in the CLA report, the report that Office of Finance put together. The first one, as far as registered and timely filed, does indicate 3 years from filing due date. What was taken from CLA's report was actually a typo. So our recommendation is 3 years from the filing due date, which still would be...
Okay, so the IRS is the filing due date?
I believe that is correct, as well as Franchise Tax Board.
Let me ask you, how many businesses are we dealing with?
Well, we have over 400,000 businesses.
So the thing is, if you didn't use the due date, you'd have to have 400,000 or whatever.
Potentially, correct.
You couldn't survive with that.
What would be the mechanics of that? I mean, if somebody filed their taxes a month early,
Well, how that would impact us, cases that move forward for collection and litigation, then city attorney would be dealing, as well as Office of Finance, would be dealing with different statute end dates. So that would be very problematic in terms of processing those and ensuring that statutes are not blown, because we would have to try to keep track of different statute dates for different types of taxpayers.
I don't know if there's a typo in the Office of Finance's work, but this, I believe, was the information provided by the Office of Finance, and the Office of Finance says from the date of filing for FTB and from the date of filing for IRS.
Yeah, but I believe for both of those codes, that if the return is filed early, they're deemed filed on the date that they're due.
Correct. That is correct.
We could live.
Not your issue. Okay, got it.
February.
We can live with
Yeah, I mean, timely filing is not as, and then the other.
Are you okay with the consistency of the date?
Yes.
Yes.
February 28th,
Yes.
Timely filing.
The main thing was 3 years.
That's correct.
Correct.
And having a certain date from which it tolls.
Right.
That everybody understands.
Yeah, that's it, it's clarity, it's due on this, on this date, from this date forward, you have 3 years to be audited. And once you hit March 1st, 3 years from then, you're in the clear. That's pretty much what we're saying.
Isn't that, we don't do that now?
For a taxpayer that files timely, since it is a self-reported tax, The statute begins to run after we've completed the audit and we've issued a deficiency assessment.
Exactly.
So it starts to run once a taxpayer becomes delinquent and they failed to pay 30 days after we've identified a deficiency.
And that's where we want to get clarity and really a concise agreement. It's, you know that when you look at a return, and whatever the date it was, if it was April 15th, if it was September 15th, you know that 3 years later, you know, you've got it on your calendar, you've got a big circle around it, statute of limitations closes on both, you know, risk and opportunity. So you as a client also have to look at it and say...
What I'm finding interesting is you were so concerned about the date of filing and tracking that date, but you don't have a problem with tracking the date of delinquency.
Well, the date of delinquency it would be well known. It would be March 1st. So there's no inconsistency there.
Okay, so it's always March 1st?
It would be March 1st for an annual taxpayer, correct?
Oh, I see.
28th is the date due. The
Correct.
next day is delinquent.
Correct. And just for clarification, what Office of Finance would respectfully recommend, and that would be consistent with the Internal Revenue Service, is that the city and this committee do consider establishing a statute of limitation that would be different for taxpayers that substantially omit or report the gross receipts. That's an area that we currently do not have in our code, and that we believe would provide the protection to the city in the event that a taxpayer does file timely, but they've significantly understated and underpaid their liability. And that's on the chart that we've provided. The IRS has a...
Which one is that?
That was on the original chart that we had provided at our last meeting, and the statute on that is 6 years from date of filing for the Internal Revenue Service.
Oh, substantial omission of item.
Correct.
6 years is what the IRS does.
And we believe that would give the city...
You define that as an excess of 25%.
Correct.
Of income. And remember, we have a different animal being taxed on gross receipts.
Well, yes, definitely. Any draft proposal would address specifically to the city's gross receipts tax. But in essence, the theory is the same. If the measured, whether it's gross receipts or cost of maintenance, that essentially if that is substantially underreported by 25%, then the city would have a 6-year period. And we believe that incorporated with the changes that BTAC is recommending would be sufficient to protect the city as well as taxpayers.
So you don't have a problem with BTAC's recommendation for 3 years from the filing due date?
Correct.
You now are okay with the due date?
Yes.
And the real question is about delinquent filers?
No, the delinquent filers, I think we agree with BTAC's proposal, 3 years from the date of filing.
The date of filing?
The date of filing, because it would change, because they would now, they're late, so when they do eventually file, the statute would start running at the time that they file.
Okay, so here we do have to delete the due.
Correct.
Yes,
You have to delete due
correct.
from the chart in the CLA's.
Okay.
Let me just ask one question. On the volume of people that self-report and do it on time, is 3 years sufficient with the drill down and the auditing that you currently do?
We believe that 3 years would be sufficient, provided that we do make that change for a substantial understatement. That would allow us the additional 6 years, total of 6 years, to capture those taxpayers.
Okay, now I'm unclear as to what the difference is. I'm looking at this chart, Table 1, and I'm unclear what the City of Los Angeles says 3 years from the date taxpayer is delinquent on a deficiency assessment, and then the BTAC proposal is 3 years from due date, from filing due date. What's the difference between the two?
On the, excuse me, Councilmember, are you referring to line number 1?
Sure.
Yes. The city's current policy is, right now, if a taxpayer does file timely and they report, that the statute does not begin to run until we've actually completed an audit. So we may audit that taxpayer 4 years down the road, and at that point, once we audit them and identify a liability, if we send them a notice of that additional liability, they failed to pay that notice within 30 days, at that point, the statute begins to run. So in that sense, the city currently has a longer period than what BTAC is recommending. BTAC is recommending that the statute begin to run immediately, well, their recommendation was from the filing date, so the statute would begin to run as soon as the taxpayer filed and paid their taxes. So in some cases, the city would have a shorter period of time to identify additional liabilities that may be due to the city.
And BTAC's recommendation is consistent with most other taxing agencies, and that is that upon filing of your return, then that particular agency, because you must rely on your filing and the work papers within those returns for, future cash flow, for risk assessment, for all kinds of other tax issues. And so you have to have a clear assessment of how long a period, you're going to look at risk associated with your filing, and when do you close that risk period.
But also, I think you have a responsibility to report accurately.
Oh, absolutely. And
if you're putting the emphasis that I have this 3-year period that might come back to bite me, that's your emphasis. The emphasis should be on filing timely and accurately.
That's correct.
Because I don't think many people, I know for myself anyway, I don't put my taxes in and sit back and wait for 3 years saying they're going to call me. Yeah. I hope the effort was put in the front end to where you hope you don't get a call. Yeah. And so that's what I want to make sure is that the real emphasis, and I think that recommendation from finance about if you totally underreport things of that nature, and then you hold your breath for 3 years and say, I made it. I don't think that's what we're into.
I think the issue we have here is, one, setting a time when the statute starts tolling for filing versus assessment. That is the issue. And under the example just given, it's a 7-year tolling period, and that is not certainty for businesses, and it's not fair. But you have a 3-year statute.
But I think the issue, if I understand it, the certainty is if you do it properly and you get audited and it's correct, there's certainty. If you do it improperly and you get audited and they find out about it, it extends it. That's what I understand, if I'm accurate, how it works. So the key is, do you invest in getting it done properly, file it on time, and stay within the 3-year issue? Because if they audit it and it comes out accurate, you're talking 3 years. That's as much certainty as you can get.
Every taxing agency, Internal Revenue, the FTB goes 4 years and the BOE goes 4 years. But the point is, you can't extend out 7 years and have an equitable tax system.
Well, I think if it's audited and everything comes back fine, we don't have an issue at all. That they could be unlimited, it could be 1 day. It doesn't matter because they've done it right. So this issue comes up when there is an inaccuracy of some kind.
Correct.
And so I just want to get the language to be equivalent. And it seems to me we're creating an apples and oranges situation where we get a clear filing date, time period, or filing due date, which they've agreed on this one. But then yours is based on the date the delinquency was identified, essentially.
That's the present language, correct.
Are you sticking with that language? Are you okay with the 3 years?
No, we are in agreement with BTAC's proposal in terms of what we've discussed today. 3 years for a taxpayer that has filed timely and paid by the due date. We are in agreement with 3 years from the filing due date for that type of taxpayer.
Okay. So then we don't have any disagreement on that. We're okay.
With the recommendation that for taxpayers that have substantially omitted.
No. That's a different issue.
Okay.
I'm just looking at the first thing on the chart.
Yes, on the first one, we are in agreement with 3 years from the filing due date.
But I don't think you can ignore if
That's
they
over here.
Substantial under.
Correct.
No, that's over here. That's item number 4.
Okay.
On the chart. And so item number 1, we have agreement. And I'd love to see agreement. So the next one is registered and filed late. And we have on this one, you're okay with the filing date?
From the filing due date, correct.
No,
Same thing, yes. We're okay with that one.
You're okay with the filing due date? Yes. Did I get it backwards? On the first one, it's filing date?
We just wanted to make sure it was either February 28th or March 1st, whichever that might be. I mean, if we want to stipulate that instead of the filing due date and just stick March 1st of that respective tax year, I mean, maybe.
Just a point, that these statute of limitations are going to apply to more than just the business tax. And some returns are due at different periods. So if we amend this, we're amending this for more than just the business tax. And that's why it would have.
Where's that in the report? I mean, that's the first time I heard that.
Okay. Well, that's the way our code is written. All of our.
Well,
other
that's
tax-
fine. I'm asking, why didn't we know about that before?
We were focused on the business tax, and so a lot of these code sections, they are general, and some of them are specific, and so
Can you
this
give me
is one
some
where I
examples
missed
of
that.
other things that will change as a result of this? I mean, we can't just,
Well, it would impact some of the other taxes, such as the parking occupancy tax, it's a monthly tax. Communications users tax is a monthly tax, but the concept would be the same. The only difference, rather than an annual tax, those taxes are monthly taxes. So the impact in terms of the dates would essentially be the same application. Now, the only consideration that we would need to look at in concert with the city attorney is currently there may be state law that provides for a longer period for some of the excise taxes, the user's taxes, such as the transient occupancy tax. So that would have to be examined to ensure that those statutes are not reduced to the detriment of the city. But the application would be the same.
well, thank you for mentioning that. I mean, I don't know how we can proceed with this item if we don't know the implications of those other items.
I think we could discuss it further. I mean, the way we normally deal with our statute of limitations and look back is that we deal with all of our taxes under the same basis. And so far, what has been proposed will not be drastic changes to any of the other taxing schemes that we use. My understanding is the Office of Finance would treat them the same. But one difference is that because the other taxes don't have yearly returns, they might have quarterly or monthly returns. We can't stipulate to a date in 2105 because that will then mess up the other taxing systems. But we can still have the statute run from the filing due date or the time of filing, depending on which it's going to be. But
The problem is the recommendation before us is only limited to what is it, gross receipts tax?
I think where the discussion is going is I threw in March 1st. Let's remove that out, but just simply understand that the filing date is physically either February 28th or March 1st, or if it's some other tax, then it's obviously whatever that date is due. And so really for BTAC purposes, for business, for the gross receipts tax purposes, I just want to understand that it is the filing date, which is...
The filing dates for every other thing is not before us.
Exactly. And so the year...
No, wait a minute. Just let me manage my meeting. The filing dates for any other thing is not before us.
Well, it's not before you, but the business tax section of our taxing code sets forth the basic statute of limitation provisions that every other tax uses. They all refer back to 2105. So the two options are to change our entire taxing structure for every other tax and have a separate statute of limitations for each one, or to keep in mind that changing the business tax statute of limitations will change the other ones as well, because they all reference this. The way our system is set up, all of our...
Okay, I got you on that. I'm just saying that you should have mentioned that last month. I mean, instead of telling us now. when we've got the decision before us. I don't know what the ramifications of that are. In other words, I don't know what implementing this policy change will do to those other tax things, because we only viewed it, the CLA only viewed it from B-tax recommendation, which did not include those other considerations. I don't know. Right now, it's very confusing. And I certainly don't want to go through this discussion now again. I just want to get to a decision. So let me understand you again. Are you okay with applying, based on what the city attorney has just said, are you okay with applying this standard to the other tax issues?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to run with that.
All you're saying is you don't want to put a date in there, you're saying the filing date.
I understand what he's saying, and that. So, but since you don't care, I don't care.
No, what the city attorney said is consistent with our current policy.
Okay. So you're okay with changing registered and timely filed. Registered and filed late, is there a discrepancy here, or are you on the same page now?
3 years from filing date.
But that's where BTEC is, so you're fine with that, so we're okay there. Non-registered and no filing, we already made a recommendation, and we're going to come back with a recommendation from you on the
Voluntary disclosure.
4, 6, or 8 year limit. Substantial omission item, there was no recommendation from BTEC. Do you have any problem with creating a category for substantial omission of items in excess of 25%?
I think there we either,
So that we can make it consistent with the
I think
IRS?
3 years, just based on, if you file late, really, you have, the clock starts ticking.
No, this isn't filing late.
Right, but what I'm saying, the city should have a finite amount of time to find those omissions. And so right now, it's.
Well, they're saying 6 years.
No, the whole point for the 3-year statute of limitations is so.
Wait,
You've got certainty, you've got consistency. You have 3 years to perform an audit. If you perform an audit in 3 years, you'll find those omissions during that time frame. You don't have 3 years in a day, 4 years in a day, 5 years in a day, 6 years a day. You have a 3-year statute of limitations to perform the audit. And that's
Since
the rule.
BTEC has not had a chance to consider that, that's essentially your opinion.
I think it's the 4 of us, which is not BTEC, you're correct. It's 9 which is BTEC. We're happy to take that one. If we have a meeting next week in BTEC, we can take this up at that time, so deliberate if you'd like us to do so.
Okay. City Attorney, did you have something to say?
Yes, one of the issues with the 6 years from date of filing that we're going to come up against is that, again, this applies to other taxes. And so, for instance, with the parking occupancy tax, if there's a gross understatement of revenues, that's a difficult audit to do for the Office of Finance. It's going to be more time consuming. That's one of the reasons I believe we're asking for a longer period. And so those are the sorts of circumstances that are going to come up.
Okay, we're going to refer that matter back to BTEC. There was no recommendation, but we will consider it. Okay, so we're going to refer the consideration of substantial omission in excess of 25% to BTEC, just to get your input. And what about fraudulent returns?
I think we agree that the no limitations on fraudulent. I mean, that's.
Okay, then we don't even have to raise that issue.
Yes.
We don't do that. We don't do that now?
Currently, no. No, we do have.
Well, might as well throw it in the report. So we're okay on that. Now, did the CLA get all of this?
Yes.
Okay. Because
I got all this.
actually, there was more
Tomorrow when I
agreement
go
than all
back
that
to
discussion was
Wednesday.
worth. Don't ask me to repeat it. CLA got it, but, well, we're going to have.
We'll work with the clerk and we'll make sure that this is all clear and all the
Okay,
language is straight.
Okay, so okay. The CLA will work with the clerk to ensure that the report is accurate. Because we're sending all of these items to council directly, except for the consideration of the time period. But we're sending the council file and asking for the Department of Finance to come back with a report at the next meeting.
So for the record, are we, okay, We're approving recommendation number 1, the first piece, amending to instruct the CLA city attorney work with BTAC, and then we got to recommendation number 2, seemed to be approved. And then after that, it's a little hazy here. So are we going forward with the other ones with the proviso to report back, or how are we doing
Yes.
that?
Item number 3 in the CLA recommendation is to use the IRS on the non-filers, and that the council, I believe, the committee, I believe, just amended that to conform the tolling periods as well to the BTAC recommendation, and then to add in the fraudulent item and to request BTAC to report back on substantial omissions.
Okay.
Okay.
If we have no objection on that, then that will be the recommendation of this committee. Do we have objection? Or we have concurrence?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Then that matter is approved as recommended. Okay, now for the hard stuff. No. Okay, recommendation number 3.
Yes. This was a BTAC recommendation to change the refund period to 3 years. The city attorney reports that Charter Section 350 concerning claims prevents going to a 3-year period. The charter limits these types of claims to only 1 year. And so we recommend leaving this as is.
Well, frankly, the option would be for the council to go to the charter.
Yes.
And
to go to the voters.
So we would need to understand what that means. If that's, there was no specific recommendation from BTAC to recommend a charter change, but that's what it would require. Charter changes, of course, have to be approved by the voters. I'll tell you what, let me refer...
Our recommendation was to amend the business tax ordinance. I think whether it requires a charter change or not is a detail, granted. But I don't think it changes the brunt of what we're saying. What we're saying is
It's a detail.
3 years. I appreciate it.
Are you going to raise the money to change the charter?
No, I think I'm already investing enough in what I'm doing right now with respect to the city without raising money.
But believe me, if you go to a charter change, you're going to invest a lot more. So I'll tell you what, the finding of the CLA and the city attorney is that would require a charter change. And so I'd like to refer the matter back to BTAC to consider that recommendation in the light of requiring a charter change. And because your recommendation doesn't tell us what to do, it just says we want to change from 1 to 3 years. We don't have the power to do that. So if you really want to go to a charter change, and frankly, I wouldn't be surprised at the end of all your considerations, there's a lot of things you want to change, and that would be appropriate. But if we're going to go to the charter once, we don't want to go to the charter for 50 different items 50 different times. If we're going to go to a charter change, then we would like to encapsulate all your recommendations, or those obviously that we concur with. But so if you want to slide that over into the potential charter change considerations, I encourage BTAC to look at charter change as one of your recommendation options, but I would ask that you include many items, not just one. Okay? Because it is a very costly endeavor, and for me to convince the council, for us to convince the council that it's needed, I think they would need to see a lot more than just one item.
Mr. Chair, since we have actually no knowledge of how expensive it is, can you maybe share with us what it costs?
Depends on how controversial it is, but the ballot alone, the addition on the ballot costs money, so I don't know. Do you have any idea?
It depends on the election that it would go to. I assume this would go to a municipal election, and the clerk budgets into the cost of a municipal election a limited number of ballot measures, and any additional ballot measure has an additional cost. So I think it's either 2 or 4 that's built into the budget. So
Two or
for initiatives or referenda or charter changes of this measure. And that's often, there's always something on a pension change or a tax or something like that. So this
You'll
would-
be able to consider that in BTAC, and you should have the advice from the city clerk and the CLA, but the bottom line is that you'll be competing with other measures that go on the ballot, and we try to limit them because it gets very confusing to the voters. So let's move on to recommendation number 4.
Item number 4 is a recommendation to change the city attorney's settlement authority from $50,000 to $100,000 principal. And there's additional research that we need to do on this one as well. The settlement section of the administrative code covers all types of settlements, whether it's a cash settlement on a dog license or a permit or all kinds of things. And it may be completely appropriate to do this for the business tax and not for some other type of settlement. So we wanted to make sure that we had some additional analysis of the types of settlements that fall into this class and get a sense of how many are business tax, how many are other than business tax, and then make a recommendation based on the data that's available.
Let me ask you, what's the rationale? I didn't quite understand it, for increasing.
The rationale was to speed up resolution of claims. And in point of fact, when we had the meeting that Councilman Alarcon requested that the committee requested that we have all hands meeting later that week with CLA, CAO, and Office of Finance voiced their support for this recommendation.
I'm saying, what's the rationale?
Well, let me just say that the number has not been increased since the 70s.
I know, but the thing is that I think you're ignoring the council put in place something called the Claims Board, and on settlements, city attorney has 50,000. Anything under 99,000, 50 to 99 goes to the Claims Board. Anything above that goes to council. And so I'm trying to find out what is it that we're trying to achieve, because that process is in place now on all settlements that go into those numbers.
It was simply to speed it up. I myself was part of a couple of different, working with a couple of different clients who had settled, owed the city money and couldn't pay because it hadn't gone to council yet for final approval on settlement.
If it's under 100,000, it never goes to council.
In this case right now, it's at 50,000
Then it goes to
and
the claim board from 50 to 99.
And two reasons. One, expediency, and two, really just keeping up with inflation. I think this was last updated, a couple of 10 years ago, maybe.
Well, I think what Mr. Parks is saying is in the 70s, when it was 50,000 for the city attorney, we didn't have a claims board. So now we have a claims board. So there is a level of review that before going to council.
And the thing is that, and I don't think it's a delay going to the claims board. We could double check that with the city attorney, because the claims board meets every Monday at 11:15.
Yeah, so so anything 50 to 100 goes directly to the claims board.
When was that claims board established?
It was probably established about 15 years ago.
Let me ask you, did the BTAC not know, were you not aware of the claims board?
We had no knowledge of this claims board. It never came up in our deliberations.
Interesting.
So we'll take it back to the committee, but it may be that this recommendation goes away.
But the impetus was to speed up the process, we believe, when we made the recommendation, so we could generate more money quickly.
Maybe the need is to do a better job of informing people about the claims board.
The thing is that
Maybe we need counsel.
If it's slowed down, then the city attorney's office, and he primarily represents them on these issues. It's a matter, I don't see how it slows down, because we meet every week, and we have an agenda that these things come through, and if it's approved by the claims board, 2-1 to 3-0, it's done. If it goes above that, it goes to council.
The important point that I see is, I think it's important that BTAC have knowledge of the city rules, so we don't spend time, that's something that's already been done.
Yeah.
And
But
leave that
these are closed sessions, so they're not open to the public.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, but CLA, CAO, and Office of Finance attend all of our meetings, and none None of those parties brought the claims board to our attention when this subject came up on more than one occasion.
Yeah, obviously, if we increase the amount of the city attorney, there would be a conflict in our rules between what goes to the city attorney, what goes to the claims board, and then, so we have to change some other rules before we change that. So I think you should take a look at the claims
We
board
will.
activity, and we'll refer this matter back to BTAC for further understanding. If nothing else, you need to understand it, and maybe there will be some other kinds of recommendations that emerge regarding that concern. If we're all in agreement with that, and maybe you can invite Mr. Parks to tell you about the claims board.
They're closed session, but again, it's every Monday, 11:15.
Okay, recommendation number 5.
Item number 5 would ensure that no decision of an auditor or the Board of Review can be overturned by a future auditor or Board of Review if the material business facts and circumstances remain unchanged. The city attorney has presented an ordinance revision to you concerning Board of Review decisions and not overturning those. However, the question of whether auditor decisions can or cannot be overturned by a future auditor, the recommendation is to not accept that. That would have a significant impact on the way these programs are operated, and we recommend that you already have the first element in front of you. Have already acted on that. The second element, we would recommend that you set that aside. And I understand that this is an area of significant disagreement between us and BTAC, so I'm sure that they have some comments on this.
And what is the Board of Equalization's process?
Board of Review.
17.
No, the Board of Equalization. What is their process?
They write a letter to the file and basically to issue the way the process works is there's a information document request, the audit occurs, and at the end there's assessment audited information, and that's written to the taxpayer basically saying which codes were cited, what the determination was, how that was based, and then that goes to the file, and the client, the taxpayer then signs off on the finding by the FTB. And so that particular finding, it just means you can't be looked at for the same thing twice, almost like double jeopardy. And that's really what we're asking, is that if an auditor goes through the process, files everything correctly, cites everything correctly. Obviously, I think in the recommendation, it said there might be a little bit more work for the auditor. Well, that's how it should be. They should write very detailed memos at the end of each audit stating how they got to that position. And so if the taxpayer relies on that audit memo and puts it in their file, and so does the city, then no future auditor can come back and say, by the way, all things remaining the same, we're now treating you differently.
Okay, I guess I'm not understanding the process. Can the CLA tell me, we've already agreed that we should not force additional penalties and back taxes on people who have a subsequent audit. Is that correct? That changes the decision of the first audit.
In the Board of Review. But this is the initial audit. This is being extended to the initial audit. There's this process where there's an initial
where
audit.
a Board of Review has made a decision and a subsequent Board of Review changes the decision that the company should not be subject to back taxes and penalties, correct?
Yes. Correct? Yes. Yeah.
Yes, so isn't that the meat of what you're trying to accomplish here?
Just to add, this is at the audit level, and the procedure, in the example with the Board of Equalization, as the audit's finished and the taxpayer feels that this point has already been covered and they've been approved to act in a certain manner, the procedure is the taxpayer writes a letter to the Board of Equalization at audit level stating their case, and it's either accepted or not accepted at the audit level. So it doesn't have to go to the next level. We don't have the expensive reviews. So it's a policy consistent with the Board of Equalization, and also it's a policy that makes it economical in your audits to resolve them at that level, so you don't have to go to the AOR, the BOR, and potentially court.
Any comments on this one?
I would say that I agree that if it goes to the Board of Review, that there shouldn't be a retraction, but I think we should go back to 2000 and whatever, that they're binding, as opposed to advisory. And then the Board of Review is intact. But I don't agree that audits have the same weight.
And why is that, council member?
Because I think the issue is you go through an audit, and any employee can make a mistake, and if you take it to a Board of Review and they finalize it, I think it's done. But if a person does a work product, and that work product is an error, I think the general manager or anyone in that department has a right to go back and inspect work of employees. And if you do a future audit, I think you have a responsibility to say, I found errors, let me go back and find out if those same errors were in a previous audit. So I think it's a work product until I think it's binding if it goes to Board of Review. And that's where I think it got confused, because it was an ordinance change that made it advisory, and we lost the issue of it being binding.
And I think the system has to be set up in such a way where the auditor does report his finding before giving it to the taxpayer, to a supervisor, who then does technical review and signs off on it, which then that finding is issued to the taxpayer, and they rely on that for operation, for continue to operate their business. So if you're treating an HMO like an HMO this year, and then all of a sudden you're treating them like a separate entity next year, just because we found an error, I mean, someone has to be held responsible for that, whether it's at the auditor or at the supervisor level.
I think they should be trained if they make mistakes, but I don't think we're obligated to stay for life because somebody audited something and put it in print, and for the rest of our lives, we have to stick with that assessment.
But how do we deal with a situation where a business detrimentally relies on that audit finding and makes their plans going forward based on what an auditor has found about their business without any material changes? How do we deal with the fact that they are then relying on that audit finding in developing their business plan, their investment plan, everything else going forward, and then we change the rules on it?
I think it's the way I understand it, the audit is done, it's an internal process. It's the Board of Review that used to be the authority. Somewhere we put in an ordinance and we lost the binding part of it. It became advisory, and then it began to unravel. But
so if a business were to get an audit finding that would be advantageous to the business could then nonetheless get that audit solemnized by the Board of Review, if you will, so that it would then be binding and not be able to be reversed in the future.
I don't think there's any reason for them to take it to the Board of Review if the audit's completed and the business is fine with the results of that audit. I agree with what you're saying, Councilmember Krikorian. You are going to have a situation where once an audit is done, the business is going to rely upon that. The business is going to conduct its business going forward on that basis. And then to be in a situation where they're told several years later, if they've made whatever investment, they've set up whatever additional facilities, they've done whatever they've done based on their understanding as to how they are being taxed within the city limits of Los Angeles, to then say, oops, we made a mistake, let's change it. And the business says, okay, well, I wish you'd told me that before I sunk another few $1 million into this plant, because I sure as heck wouldn't have done that. I would have left the city limits. I don't think that's a catch-22, and to differentiate between the decision that the auditor makes versus the decision that the Board of Review makes. Before I became an investment banker, I was at Touche Ross, and I guarantee there was no audit that somebody did of any client that wasn't reviewed by a supervisor and then ultimately by a partner. So I'm presuming the Office of Finance has some kind of cross-check, that there is some kind of supervision that's exercised by the Office of Finance.
But I think the issue is the appeal process. If the city makes a mistake or its employees, the business has the ability to go to a review of the Board of Review. The only controls we have internally, if an employee makes a mistake, it's done by the oversight of the supervisors and future audits. So we don't take cases to the Board of Review. It's to the benefit of the taxpayer to use the Board of Review. It's supervision and management that correct employees' errors.
Did the city attorney want to contribute?
Councilman, if there is a taxpayer that is concerned about their tax status at the audit level, they have even if they agree with the audit, they have the right to go forward to the Board of Review and get a determination. So any taxpayer that's in the situation of desperately needing to plan what their business tax liability is for the future based on an audit result has the ability to.
I don't think that was the point. I think what the point was that when you have one audit that is making findings that cause a business to change its procedures to adhere to the audit recommendations, and then a subsequent audit reverses that, then why should they be subject to the second audit findings?
Well, if they are concerned about that, the taxpayer has the right under our code to have a Board of Review determination, and under our code as it's going to be revised, that Board of Review determination then will lock in those findings. But until we get to that level, the way our process works now, the level of detail that is kept in the files of auditors would not allow me as the city attorney to go back and look at that prior audit. It's not until it goes to the Board of Review level that there's enough information that's retained or examined usually for me to make those sorts of determinations. So we'd have to drastically change the way that the Office of Finance is currently reviewing these cases.
I don't know how drastic that would be. If you're saying that they're not maintaining proper records in their files, then I think that's frankly a policy that it's good. It's just good policy. You're only talking about a 3-year period to begin with for them to keep those files current and accurate. But I also think it's interesting that what the city attorney is saying is trying to encourage more issues to arise at the level to go to the Board of Review, which doesn't sound like it's the objective here. We're not trying to have more issues litigated in front of the Board of Review. I thought we were trying to make it so that you have less and you get a more efficient.
Frankly, I don't think we're going to get to a determination today. So I'd like to hold that matter under consideration and move on with the other recommendations. So the report would read that we are going to refer the recommendations, or this recommendation will be heard in this committee again. How do we do that?
Okay, well, we're going to have to send this matter forward to council since some of these pieces were approved.
So the recommendation would be to refer item 5 back to...
or they're going to have to report back and at such time be put into this matter and then it'll be referred back to committee.
Yeah, just hold this item in committee.
Yeah, well, no, we can't hold it in committee because it's part of the council file.
The number.
But when it goes to council, we refer recommendation number 5 back to committee for further consideration.
That's recommendation as contained in the CLA's report, or is that recommendation number 5 in?
There is no recommendation in the CLA report on this matter, so it sounds like this would be a new recommendation from the committee to request a report back in 2 weeks on this matter.
All right.
Okay. I thought we took care of item number 6.
Item number 6 is taken care of.
Did we take care of that? Yes, okay. Item number 7.
Item number 7, it would create a classification upon registration program. This would be a new business that would come into the city of Los Angeles and have work with the Office of Finance to determine exactly what their tax classification.
What was VTAC's recommendation here?
To create this program.
Okay, and the CLA's recommendation?
That this is a good idea. This is a good way to attract new businesses and offer a new service to businesses. However, the city attorney has determined that there are issues with implementation, and we need to figure out whether this requires a contract, because one of the key elements of the BTAC recommendation is that this is binding, and I understand that recommendation. That recommendation makes sense. However, to make a binding classification requires a contractual agreement or some other arrangement between the city and the taxpayer that memorializes that, and we don't know what that mechanism is.
Okay, so would it be appropriate for the committee to recommend support for this BTAC recommendation?
In concept?
In concept?
And request city attorney and CLA and Office of Finance to report back with the...
Why don't we just support it and then ask the city attorney to come back with a report on implementation?
How to implement.
Okay, but that's fine, and I think one of the things we talked about when we had the meeting that you requested we hold with other departments of the city was potentially charging a fee, since this does require some work to be performed by the Office of Finance that they do not currently perform, this whole pre-registration determination. But what I thought was a little troubling to me is what I saw in the write-up by CLA was referencing to the city attorney that this requires some kind of a contractual arrangement, and perhaps there should be consideration, well, number one, paying a fee, whether it's $1 or $250 or whatever the number would be, clearly is consideration to make a contract binding. And yet the city attorney also raises the question of, for example, businesses participating in this program would pay a fee to do so and would agree to remain in the city for a certain period of time. That, to me, is like saying, okay, let's now all of a sudden impose something onerous on this business, saying, hey, by the way, we're happy to tell you what your classification is going to be, but you have to agree to be in the city for 5 years in order for us to do that. And to me, that's absurd.
Okay, let me restate the recommendation of this committee. The recommendation of this committee was to support BTAC's recommendation and to ask the city attorney to report back to the committee on implementation. I made no reference to any of those things you just mentioned. Okay, so we'll take it from there, and then we'll see what happens when it comes back. Then if it comes back with all those things, then you can weigh in at that time, all right? Great. Item number 8. Do I have a concurrence on that?
That's good.
Yeah, okay, so Mr. Parks and I concur on that. Item number 8.
Item 8 would increase the appeal period from 15 days to 60 days, as recommended by BTAC. We've looked at appeal periods for a number of different programs in the city, and the standards for appeal periods in different city programs are between 15 and 20 days. The outset was a hearing examiner decision on parking tickets for 30 days if you're going to appeal that to the county. So in looking at this, there were a number of ways to look at it. And at this point, our recommendation is no change to the appeal period.
We strongly disagree with that recommendation, and we're surprised by the recommendation. In the meeting that we had, again, with the CLA, CAO, and Office of Finance concurred with our recommendation, which was a 60-day recommendation, to change it from 15 days to 60 days. They indicated they had no objection, and my notes so reflect that.
And as we discussed,
CLA, I'm still speaking. Thank you. If you could hold on for a moment, I would greatly appreciate it. The example on a parking ticket talks about 14 to 21 days. Bear in mind, there's no delay in the person being notified that they've received a ticket. They walk to the car, the ticket is waiting for them. So they know that the time frame has kicked in. The big issue we have is when you notify somebody by mail, guess what? They don't necessarily get it exactly when you think they get it. Now, case in point, this is an envelope that I received earlier this week from Councilmember Richard Alarcon, addressed to me. The letter itself is dated May 11th, in case you'd like to verify. The postmark is May 20th. The postmark is May 20th.
Mm-hmm.
So this sat for 9 days before it ever got to the post office, and then didn't arrive in my office until yesterday. So if we had a 15 days, I think I would have 1 day to make my mind what to do.
What is that letter?
This letter, Councilmember Alarcon is asking BTAC to respond on the mayor's request to take a look at BOR and expand it from 3 to 5.
Oh, okay, but that's not a...
That's not. But this is my point. This is the way postage works at the city. Is I have received such letters from Office of Finance, and they have been exactly that way.
I'm not sure I concur.
So have others. I mean, this is, if you want to know where our recommendations come from, just to refresh everybody's recall, our recommendations come from various practitioners who have told us what the issues are that their constituencies have as a constant refrain. So again, we're talking about fairness, and we're talking about trying to reduce the amount of knee-jerk appeals that would occur.
What is the problem with increasing the appeal period, the timeline to file an appeal? I'm not quite understanding. What is the problem?
As Mr. Greif is stating, there's concern that the mail doesn't reach the taxpayer in time for the taxpayer to make a decision whether to appeal or not. if they don't, the taxpayer doesn't have enough time to make a good decision on whether they should appeal.
What would happen if we changed it to 30 days? Would we find agreement then?
Just to be clear, Office of Finance indicated they were agreeable.
Yes, 30 days.
But Antoinette, am I misstating, did you not agree, and you were in that meeting, that 60 days, so was Ed, that 60 days was fine? My notes reflect that, my notes aren't fabricated.
And as Mr. Greif will also remember from that meeting, we discussed the fact that by adding these additional days to each of these appeal periods, we are extending the taxpayer's period of uncertainty by as many as 90 days. So we're extending any appeal process for an additional 3 months, which is a concern in terms of being efficient and effective in addressing the taxpayer's concerns. So that was an issue that we were balancing at that meeting.
Okay. Antoinette, could you?
Yes, Antoinette Crispo, Office of Finance. We did say that we're open to changing the time period, certainly up to 60 days if that is what, the council wants. But we do think that, just looking at the CLA's report in terms of what other city departments do, that perhaps maybe instead of 60, something, say 30 or 45 days. But I think the one thing that's very important to note is that we don't follow specifically or hold businesses to the 15-day period. We do allow additional time if they want to actually go forward with a hearing request. So we don't necessarily follow the 15 days as it is in the code itself. So I guess bottom line is that, we're open. It's really, it's...
Let me ask one thing, and one of the two things I looked at in the response, if you go 15 days and they do appeal, what's the timeline of the appeal and coming to a conclusion?
Well, that can generally take, for an ARO hearing, it could take up to 90 days, and then if they request to go before the Board of Review, which they have an option to do if they don't agree with the ARO hearing, an additional 90 days. And just one thing just to note is that the decision to go forward with a hearing by a business doesn't constitute or require them to have their working papers before the Office of Finance within that 15-day period. Right, and they can actually, at the same time, go to the Settlement Bureau if they want to settle the case, as opposed to continue with the hearing process. So we do provide flexibility, but as I've said, it's if a decision is made to extend it, of course, it's going to delay getting a decision on a hearing, but it does provide additional time.
The other thing is probably the most contentious things we deal with are planning appeals, and they're sitting at 15 to 20 days, and that's something that fills our agenda routinely in the sense of people appealing. And so I looked at it in the sense of all they have to make a decision is say, I'm going to appeal. They don't have to bring paperwork. They don't have to show what they're going to appeal. They could just put a placeholder. I don't know whether... That
is correct. And at the time when they request a hearing, the hearing is generally scheduled within 30 to 90 days. And so they have ample time to submit their documentation. So I was thinking that perhaps, given what is being proposed, perhaps maybe 30 days, if BTAC agrees with that.
Oh, I think if 60 days, okay, so essentially what you're saying, 30 days plus 30 days to have the hearing, and in that time, so in 60 days, they would have the opportunity to make a final determination of whether they want to appeal, and they would have the opportunity to prepare their case. That would be a minimum, right?
It would be 120 days, because it's 90 days with the ARO hearing, up to 90 days.
No, but you said the hearing would be established 30 to 60 days.
It's up to 90 days. It really depends on...
Okay, 30 to 90 days. But the point is, if they have a 30-day review or 30 days to file their appeal, then they would have another 30 days minimum, 30 days to 90 days to prepare their case or decide not to pursue.
Right, and we do allow flexibility in terms of the business providing their position paper. I know in some cases we do accept it the day of the hearing, so it's not that we very restrict in that regard. We do try to be flexible for the business.
Well, in these cases, I'm inclined to find the middle ground, but that would be 37 and a half days. So I'm inclined to either go to 45 or 30.
BTAC would be agreeable to 45 days, Councilmember Alarcon.
We're fine with that. Can we go with that?
That was the easiest thing we did all day. Okay, is the committee fine with that?
You know, I just want to make one point. I don't want down the road that you get to 45 and then come back later and say the 90 days is added to it and another 30 to 60 if you go the full route. So that if we're talking about consistency and reliance, you're now pushing this off.
Well, we can insert a clause that any subsequent BTAC recommendation is not allowable. How's that?
Thank you very much.
Because we see these things have a new life. And the issue is, down the road, you add 90 and another 60.
I don't, yeah,
about 6 months before you get
Yeah.
the decision.
I don't think this is going to change the process enormously, but I think it will give an opportunity to some businesses to do a better job of effectuating their appeal.
Yeah.
And that's fair.
Councilman, I think the most important thing is it sends a message that we're business-friendly,
Yeah.
nothing intangible.
I understand that. But the most important thing to me is item number 9.
The interest rate to be paid. And BTAC recommended that the rate be changed to, match the IRS rate of 3 percentage points above the federal short-term rate. And council just changed this, suggested this, to be the federal short-term rate, the average for July, August, September. So our recommendation is to retain the policy that the council just adopted, see how that works, and go from there.
Mr. Parks?
Yeah, the reason that the change is made, we followed BTAC's recommendation and evened those up, and it cost us about $700,000 in 2 years of paying interest for business mistakes of overpaying. And so we corrected it and said, if you make a mistake and you overpay, the city should not be paying the same amount as the interest we're charging you if you underpay, which is really the incentive to pay timely and accurately. And so that's basically why the change was made. It was exorbitant what the city was paying, and none of them were the city's mistake. They were all the business mistakes.
Okay, so as I understand it, Budget and Finance Committee recommended and the council approved a change in this policy area just recently?
Just very recently. December 16th. December of last year.
December 16th. I think we would like to see what happens with that. At least I would. And so I'd like to refer this item number 9 back to BTAC and with an opportunity to review what happens with the new policy.
We would agree.
Okay, then that will be the order. BTAC recommendation number 10.
This would be to create an offer and compromise program. The council acted to approve the implementation of this program in the budget just last week, so this is moving forward. Again, it's just an area where Office of Finance should come forward with the implementation plan.
Okay, then we approve the CLA's recommendation in that regard, which concurs with BTAC's recommendation.
Yes, it does.
Great. Well, I think we made significant progress, even though it was sometimes going like going to the dentist. But I think this is a good indication. I hope that we didn't belabor the process too much, and we still have some work to do with these recommendations. But frankly, I want you to move forward with other recommendations and focus your time and energy on those. I apologize for the lengthy meeting, but I wanted to make sure, and we're still not done. I wanted to make sure these were dealt with, and I think we're making significant progress. So I want to thank you. Now we still have another BTAC item, which is item number 2 regarding the Board of Review.
Item number 2, City Attorney Report, Ordinance and Communication from BTAC relative to Business Tax Administrative Appeals Process Decisions and Reclassifications. This item has also been referred to the Budget and Finance Committee.
Deputy City Attorney Dan Whitley.
I'm sorry, does somebody want to, do we have a CLA report on this?
No, not on the BTAC letter.
Okay, do we have a report from the city attorney on this?
We do. There's a report and an ordinance. I can go through the ordinance if you'd like.
Well,
Can we get a copy of that report?
as I understand it,
I only have one copy.
you have to wait, 13 days, I think, before yours gets to you in the mail. Oh, wait a minute, it didn't come from
My
my
mistake,
office.
my
It
mistake.
didn't come from my office, so you may already have it, I don't know. Okay, wait a minute, as I understand the recommendations, the BTAC recommendations were immediately expand the board from, to 5 members from its current 3. Do you concur?
I concur. I believe that's being taken care of through the mayor's office and the Office of Finance.
I'm just
I understand that.
The current
I
board is
understand that.
advisory, selected by the general manager.
Correct, by the director.
Okay, but then we're saying with this
Oh, my
new
God.
configuration, all the positions are taken out of the general manager's control.
No, the change to the makeup of the board is being done through the director of finance, is my understanding, and through the mayor's office.
What we have is that they're showing the mayor makes a couple, the president of the council makes a couple, and the controller makes one.
I don't have that ordinance before you. This is ordinance 2116I. This is an amendment to 2116I, which addresses when a determination by the Board of Review is changing an earlier determination by a Board of Review with respect to classifications.
Oh, no, we're talking about membership, I think, isn't it?
John Wickham, CLA, that is a supplemental matter that's been brought forward to you by BTAC, a letter issued May 20th, in which BTAC recommends a change in the structure of the Board of Review by the appointments, Mr. Parks, that you just mentioned. That has not been addressed by the city attorney yet. They apparently haven't received that document themselves. I guess that's in the mail, too.
So this is just the Board of Review part.
Well,
I'd
we're
received it.
considering the BTAC recommendations, so I was hoping to take up the entire matter, but for the purposes of,
We could read the motion that we made.
can we go through the recommendations from BTAC and one at a time and see if we can't get conclusion? Please.
Sure, you're talking about the letter?
Yeah.
That you received?
Yeah, I know it's here someplace.
All right, so recommendation was to expand the Board of Review from 3 members to 5 members.
Okay, do we have an issue on that?
No issue on that.
Okay,
No legal issue.
the question is, how do we make those appointments? The recommendation was to have 2 appointees by the mayor, 2 appointees by the council president, and 1 appointment by the city controller.
That is correct.
And the mayor's letter is somewhat different.
What is the mayor's letter?
He says that the membership be changed to include 3 members of the public to serve alongside the representatives from finance and controller. So he's basically merging 3 public members into the existing 2 members that are on the advisory.
The public members, the appointees by the mayor and the appointees by council president could be public members, so
Actually, are you referring to the mayor's proposal or our proposal?
the mayor's...
When you raise that?
Well, actually, there's nothing that, with regard to the public members, there's nothing that necessarily conflicts there.
No, well, they said, the mayor's just saying merge them into the advisory, but he kept the finance and controller in place, or the representatives.
I think there's 2 proposals here. I think the mayor's proposal, and I looking over my shoulder, see a representative of the mayor's office present. I think the mayor's proposal was something that could be enacted immediately. I believe our proposal would require an additional step and therefore couldn't be enacted immediately. So the question is, do you want to do something right away and then adopt our, or recommend our proposal for...
Okay, can we have the mayor's office step forward?
Gabriel Sermano from the Office of Mayor of Villaraigosa.
What?
So our letter dated May 6th to the city, directing, it was to Antoinette Cristoval and CC'd City Council and the Controller. The idea was to amend the board of review. After consulting with the city attorney, we were advised that we were able to change the makeup without having to go through the ordinance process.
Can I just ask you to sort of get to the point? Do you disagree with BTAC's proposal?
We think the Office of Finance should maintain
Okay, so that
membership on the board.
that isn't just a temporary fix, that is a permanent disagreement? You think there should be somebody from the Office of Finance on the Board of Review?
Yes.
And BTAC disagrees with that?
Yeah, we strongly disagree with that. Number one, what's being reviewed is Office of Finance determinations. You don't have, if you're going to have an impartial determination, then to have somebody from the Office of Finance be one voice out of 3 or one voice out of 5, it is still a foregone conclusion what that decision is going to be.
Okay, now
you don't have a judge, when you have an appeal, you don't have a judge who is in the lower court then sitting in the higher court making a determination on the lower court's decision.
I hope you don't pull out another letter.
I won't.
What I'm trying to get at is so do you have a problem with the appointments as recommended by BTAC? 2 from the mayor, 2 from the council president,
Not particularly.
and 1 by the controller.
Our letter also kept 1 from the controller's office and 3 to be appointed by finance.
3 to be appointed by finance?
Correct. Keeping it the way the structure by the current ordinance.
No.
Direct.
We're talking about the appointments.
But the 3 that were to be appointed by finance would be members from the public, not members from the Office of Finance. So there would be 5. There'd be the controller's office.
Okay, I'm getting a little confused here because what was represented by Mr. Greif was that the mayor's office implemented something that could be implemented immediately as a temporary sort of stopgap until we get to another process. I'm trying to get a sense of where the mayor wants to end up. Is the mayor in disagreement with the BTAC's proposal? What elements of BTAC's proposal is the mayor disagreeing with?
Well, again, we should maintain a member from the Office of Finance to be on the board.
Okay, I got
And
that part.
The appointment, we don't have a particular problem with the appointment.
You don't have a problem with the mayor appointing 2, the council president appointing 2, and the controller appointing 1?
Correct.
So you're okay with that? Okay. So, city attorney, let me get this right. So the only disagreement is whether or not finance is participating on the board of review.
Well, from the city attorney's perspective, our main concern is having any appointees by members of council. That's going to
Could you speak into the mic?
I'm sorry, I thought I was. If any of the members are appointed by council, this will be converted into a Brown Act body. That was the reason that the board of review was initially changed from a binding authority into an advisory body earlier. And so that would be from the city attorney's office, that would be our concern with this recommendation. We do support having a member of the Office of Finance on the board, but that's not a legal issue. That would be a policy determination.
Okay, so before we get to the Department of Finance representative, I want to understand the Brown Act concern. So if the mayor appoints all of them.
The mayor is not part of the legislative body of the city of Los Angeles. The council is. So if council appointees are on the board, then this will be a legislative body under the Brown Act. That doesn't matter how many.
Could be just 1.
Correct.
Hold on just a second.
I just got this.
My chief of staff was just reminding me that if the members are confirmed by the council, there is no Brown Act.
I don't believe so. I would need to spend a little bit of time researching it. I believe that's true.
What did you say?
Saeed, tell us all why you believe that is not the case.
Yeah, I think we have about 2 or 3 dozen commissions whose members are all appointed by the mayor.
Those are all Brown Act. Oh, I'm sorry, appointed by the mayor. Yeah.
Pardon me?
I think that's true. I'm not an expert on the Brown Act. I don't know all of its ins and outs.
Well, we have time before it goes to council to worry about the Brown Act thing. Okay, so if you could review that, I don't know.
I was just wondering, I don't quite understand what you think is true.
Oh, I think that they can be appointed by the mayor or the director of finance and then approved by council. I think that is not going to make this a Brown Act.
Council's involved, I agree. I think that's what your advice has been in the past.
I believe so.
Yeah.
I think there's a concern about having the appointment, I'm assuming there's a concern by BTEC of having 3 appointments from the Department of Finance.
That's correct. I mean, right now, there's basically 2 appointments, even though, one is appointed by the mayor's office through the Office of Finance, and one is appointed by the Office of Finance, and then the last is by the Controller's Office, I believe.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us what it is?
Actually, the appointment, the public member that is currently on the board, previously, it was a recommendation of the prior VTAC, and that actual appointment went before council.
Okay, I'm sorry. What was the recommendation of BTEC?
The prior BTAC actually changed the structure of the board to have a public member of the 3-member board. So the city attorney was removed from the board, and the public member was added at the recommendation of the prior BTAC. The prior BTAC also
What was the other membership?
previously.
I mean, currently.
Currently, it's a member of the Office of Finance, who is a senior tax auditor, a member from the Controller, which is a staff person from the Controller's office, and a public member. The current public member that is on the board was recommended by the prior Business Tax Advisory Committee. This individual is a retired CPA, and at the time that the way the code was set up, that public member was confirmed by council. But when the Brown Act came into existence, there was an issue with the structure of the board where it needed to be made advisory under the Director of Finance. And so at that time, I could have very easily changed the public member to someone other than the public member that had been recommended by BTAC, but I did not, because I believe that that individual has served the city and has actually.
Okay, that isn't even relevant to our consideration here. The question is, first of all, I'm just trying to find out where I appreciate the history, though. I wasn't aware that we changed the composition under the last BTAC.
Yes, we did. It was
convening.
the recommendation of BTAC.
So, on the issue of I concur on the issue of all the BTAC members, or BTAC, all the Board of Review members having to come before council for approval, no matter who nominates them, okay? Are you okay with that, Mr. Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the question is who is making the appointments, and what is the constitution of those appointments? The mayor's office is currently recommending or making how many appointments? 1?
Well, the mayor is requesting that the board structure change from 3 to 5 members. Currently, there is only 1 public member of a 3-member board, so the mayor is asking to add 2 additional public members. So there will be 3.
I'm not on that issue. I'm asking how many appointments the mayor has right now. None?
The mayor does not have any. It's Office of Finance. Under the current.
And even though the mayor made that recommendation to add 2 public members, he did not specifically say he wanted to appoint them. He just said add 2 public members.
Oh, sure.
And the appointments are made by who now?
Office of Finance, but as I've indicated, we have not made any changes since the prior BTAC recommendation.
But I just need to know where the authority is. All 3 positions are appointed by the Office of Finance?
No. The Office of Finance, there are 2 of the 3. One is the Controller, who recommends a member on the board. The Office of Finance recommends a staff person, which is a senior person, who is not involved with the audits
Is
that are being
that
heard.
by rule? It must be a staff person?
The current code is set up in that.
Wait, the city attorney's nodding no.
No, the current code just allows the Director of Finance to create an advisory body. The makeup of the advisory body is entirely up to the discretion of the Office of Finance. However, the Office of Finance has clearly listed what the qualifications and requirements are and what the makeup of the board is going to be in its internal guidelines and on its website, I believe. Yes. Although that's not part of our municipal code.
So the Board of Review is, I'm still, who appoints the three people?
Currently, under the code, the Director of Finance has the authority to appoint everyone to
all three
the board. However, my understanding is that the Director of Finance has agreed to have the Controller's Office appoint one of those members to her advisory board, and then the other two are appointed by the Director of Finance. However, one of them is a longstanding member from the public.
Okay, without what's the legal term I'm looking for? Without stating an opinion about whether the current Board of Review is problematic or otherwise, I see a benefit to moving the appointment of the members of the Board of Review outside of the control of the Department of Finance in terms of building trust and transparency. But I'm making no statement about, frankly, I don't know a whole lot about the current Board of Review, so I'm certainly not criticizing it. The question then would be, well, if the Office of Finance is not making the appointments, who should make those appointments? And it seems to me that the mayor should be one of the appointers, and I could see perhaps one of the appointments coming from the Department of Finance, and certainly the Controller's Office should have one. I'm just having a tough time coming with the other two, because normally we just say, well, the council will appoint the other two and be done with it. But we don't want to do that because we don't want to trigger the Brown Act.
Yeah, but for me, I think the issue comes down to whether, if we're going to change it from an advisory board to the general manager, then is it going to be advisory or is it going to be binding? And I think, to me, that those questions have to be answered before I look at the makeup of the board. I mean,
Could I suggest that the city attorney give you a report on whether we can change it to be a binding authority instead of an advisory authority? Because I believe that does raise Brown Act implications.
But I think the issue of what's created the complication about Board of Review, it was a little-known board that did its work several years ago that was binding, and nobody had a complaint about it. When we changed it and some words dropped out of the ordinance and it became advisory, that's when it became a conflict, and that's when we had this issue of a subsequent board making a decision and a prior decision. I think that's the key issue, is getting, what are they going to do? If this stays advisory, we're going to have these conflicts forever. The other issue, I think, is that I'm reluctant to say that the board should not have somebody from Department of Finance, because having sat through a number of these meetings, Department of Finance is one of the few groups of people that understand the Department of Finance. And so to have 5 people sitting there in a meeting talking about some issue and not understand the mechanics and all of these rules, I think doesn't serve us. That's my opinion.
Okay, well, let me just say this. I have no problem with having one member of the panel being somebody who is appointed by the Department of Finance. But if we're going to move to 5, I think the consideration you make about whether it's binding or not is more important to me. And I don't know what the fear of the Brown Act is. What is the problem with the Brown Act?
This change was made before I was appointed to public finance, so I'd rather confer with my supervisors and give.
Well, you're the one that said that it triggers the Brown Act.
Oh, I know it triggers the Brown Act. It's not going to be.
But what's the problem with that?
You'd have to schedule the meeting and all, is that what you're saying?
You would have to notice the meeting. The meeting should be open to the public.
Oh, you mean you have to tell the public?
Yes.
Oh.
And to be open for public comment. All of the filings would then be matter of public records. We need to go through and redact things for public record before every meeting because we have confidentiality.
More work.
It's not just a matter of more work. It's a matter of administratively, we'd have to figure out how we are going to be able to have an open board of review hearing and be able to have them fully consider.
You're talking about people's personal business.
Exactly, and because someone could have to reveal trade secrets to prove they're entitled to a certain tax provision.
But couldn't you run it, we have a Brown Act issue with Claims Board, but it's closed session.
Well, again, that's why I said I'm not an expert on the Brown Act. These issues were raised. I understand why there's a Brown Act problem. I don't know all of the implications because I am not an expert.
Yeah, there should be provisions to be able to conduct private meetings under certain circumstances. So I think we've heard enough to. I think you've captured the gist of what we're saying. We'd like to move in a way that is consistent with BTAC's proposal, but we are mindful of all the considerations you raised, and so I would like you to come back with an analysis. Well, how long will it take you?
I'd like to have 30 days.
A couple of things.
This is yes.
In regards to the letter from the mayor, I think on a short gap perspective, we would like for that to be acted upon, just because it is a short-term solution.
Oh, is that fine with you?
It creates an additional effort on our part in terms of if we go forward, we select and expand the board, and then we have to change it again, and we're scheduling these hearings.
Yeah.
I would prefer that we do it once.
Yeah, I don't think 30 days is going to make that much of a difference. I appreciate your concern. We want to move forward quickly, but we want to do it right. That's more important. So I'm going to ask the city attorney to come back in, not the next meeting, but the subsequent meeting. So 2 meetings from now.
Just to be clear, BTAC is not in favor of Department of Finance having a representative.
I understand that.
And to come back to Councilmember Park's comment, there will always be a representative of Department of Finance there because its Board of Review is going to be making determinations, which presumably are going to involve the taxpayer and the Department of Finance. So somebody
I think Mr. Parks and I understand that the Department of Finance would staff this to some extent the Board of Review. I mean, they have to. Somebody has to do it.
I mean, think of it another way. Let's say Northrop Grumman is the one that's got an issue in front of the Board of Review. Does it make sense for Northrop Grumman to have somebody, one of the 5 members be from Northrop, an appointee by Northrop Grumman? I don't think so.
No, I don't think there's any.
That's the point.
No, it's not. Northrop Grumman has a direct conflict of interest.
So does the Department of Finance.
No, not necessarily. They're not
city employees.
No, they're city employees, and
they don't have.
Making a determination that involves the city involves a determination made by the Department of Finance.
They're not in a conflict of interest.
Well,
that's a stretch in the best day.
Well, you're assuming that they're going to act impartially about a determination made by the very same department that they're a member of.
The difference is they're not benefiting financially, personally. The difference is they wouldn't.
But they certainly are acting impartially, or else we would not be able to get out of Board of Reviews if they weren't acting impartially.
We're talking about perception, right? We're not talking about, I'm not inferring anything or implying anything or stating any reality, but we're talking about perception. And to have the members be expert in their fields, selected by the public, certainly has the veneer of total and objectivity and impartiality.
Okay, we are taking your concerns in consideration. I'm asking the city attorney to come back with a report that capsulizes all of this, and then we'll make a decision in about 30 days. Okay, it's not exactly 30 days.
I'll try and do this as quickly as I can.
If you can get it back in 2 weeks, if you can, we'll agendize it.
Yeah, and I will try to do that.
And please make sure that you send it to, or maybe hand deliver it to BTAC.
Email would be great, and if there's a draft.
Or you could give it to my office, and we'll be happy to mail it.
And if there's a draft that's circulated by CLA or CAO, we'd like to see the draft at the same time other people see the draft.
That's fine, no problem. Okay. Wow. I think we concluded our business. Was there was a representative of VICA that I believe has not had a chance to speak? Oh, no, it wasn't you. Yeah, but you didn't fill out a card, so. No, thank you very much. I think we're making progress on all of these issues, and, but please don't stop all the other recommendations as well. With that, no other public comment cards. Therefore, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.